Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vraks. We are finally at the finale after what I think can safely be said to have been the single biggest 40k lore series on YouTube. And whilst we are certainly in the home stretch, we're not quite done yet, and so we'll be finishing it up with a few more releases, shall we? And I think it's high time that we had a look at the situation as it stands. We have been somewhat preoccupied with the siege of the citadel itself and how it has been progressing, whilst of course the rest of the war was not yet quite done either, although it had remained deadlocked. After the Lord Inquisitor's failure to quash the pocket of Nurgle resistance, the Eastern Front had been more or less ignored. With the breaching of the curtain walls and the encirclement of the citadel, the primary objective was within reach, and so the Nurgle forces were to simply be contained. Virtually all of the heavy materiel, including the guns of those forces, would be transferred over to the encirclement of the citadel, and so the troops left with the unenviable task of containing the Nurgle troops would have to do so almost exclusively with the light and infantry artillery batteries, along with rear line formations, and only in dire circumstances would they receive any form of mechanized or armored support. On the bright side, the troops corralling the Nurgle worshippers into their small pocket were not expected to actually gain any ground, or actively attempt to defeat them. But on the other side, they were also now engaged in deadlocked trench warfare with the worshippers of Nurgle, that still had access to a fair bit of chemical weaponry. To call that segment of the war on Vraks pure living hell would be quite the understatement. Unable to push forward, unable to withdraw, and unable to really change their position or their situation in any real way, those troops were harried day and night by raids from the Nurgle forces, continuous bombardment, and the frequent application of chemical and biological weapons. Casualties were high, but the rate of attrition was within acceptable limits. But with the taking of the Cardinal Gate and the St. Leonis Gate, things began to change. It was clear to everyone with eyes to see that the Citadel was on its very last leg, and that the war was all but over. And with the defeat of the final chaotic trump card in the form of Angergrath, defeat was now certain. And whilst the worshippers of Nurgle had been preparing to summon a second greater entity of their own, they had been unable to do so, and with the relative low intensity on their part of the front, it seemed very unlikely that they would ever have another opportunity. And with the swift defeat of their first attempt at the hands of the Grey Knights, it seemed a fool's hope that they would ever be able to truly establish their demonic dominion upon the planet of Vraks. But that did not in and of itself mean that the war was over. At the very least not for the Nurgle Marines. They were fighting the long war, and if this battle was lost, the war was far from over. They would begin withdrawing into the wasteland of Vraks, down into the deep gorges and the unpassable terrain, trusting in their own vile and revolting resilience to keep them going through any harshness that this planet could visit upon them, until they could find some way to escape. And so slowly but surely they began to sneak away. In small warbands, or even as lone individuals, they vanished into the Vraxian waste, or some of the more powerful individuals that still had covens of sorcerers at their commands opened small warp rifts and leapt into them, trusting in the benevolence of their deity to deliver them safely to fresh battlefields. Or, in the judgment of their patron deities, delivering them unto the hungry bellies of their favoured servants as punishment for their failure. And they were not the only chaotic forces on Vraks that were beginning to look around for an escape route. The inquisitorial spearhead that had driven towards the Cardinal Gate had been prepared to run into Alpha Legion resistance, but the Alpha Legion had never shown. Nor were they a part of the large-scale counterattack that had acted as a massive sacrifice to summon Angergrath. Perhaps Lord Arcos and his followers had not been overly optimistic about the demon's chances, or perhaps they had been worried about the demon's disposition towards their own somewhat sneaky kind. Khorne's followers are rarely overly fond of those who utilize a bit too much subterfuge. Regardless of which it was, the Alpha Legion had apparently withdrawn into the depth of the citadel. It seemed exceptionally unlikely that even the Alpha Legion could have infiltrated out of the massed Deathcore siege lines that had been set up specifically to prevent any such escape on behalf of the chaotic forces. The last thing that the Lord Inquisitor wanted was the Alpha Legion rampaging around in his rearward lines. And then, of course, there was Legio Volcanum. Their titans had participated very briefly in the fights around the citadel. They had appeared on occasion to fire upon the attackers, or, as in the case of the attack upon the lower armory gates, as part of a trap. But by and large, Legio Volcanum had remained very passive. It was theorized that the Legion had been mauled worse than originally imagined during their confrontation with the Legio Astorum, but nevertheless, their hesitation to engage in battle seemed odd. If they truly were trapped and this was their last stand, then surely the Titans would have been used in a more active role, attempting to prolong the conflict, or maybe even trying for some kind of miraculous upturn. And yet, that had not occurred, nor had the enemy made any serious attempts at breaking out of the citadel. And for every day that passed, that seemed to be the only option left to the defenders. Clearly, they were beginning to run desperately low on manpower. The once veteran, resolute, and extraordinarily tough Vraxian defense force must have been all but spent at this point, evident by the fact that these days the enemy's counterattacks were almost exclusively made up of demons, or misshaped mutants, or other monstrosities. There was also the surprising lack of effective firepower directed down upon the Red Scorpions as they attacked up the Pilgrim Road. Lord Hector Rex was not yet sure precisely what had happened to the defenders, but it was very clear that the Vraxian Defense Force was no longer the entity it had once been. These were the questions that was passing through his mind as he made his way towards the closest friendly force to look for a Vox set. He would have to arrange a talk with the Red Scorpion commanders and the rest of the Deathcore forces, as well as the remaining Grey Knights, as to what they were to do now. The time for a major breakout attempt seemed to have passed. The Deathcore was now in command of the Cardinal Gate, the St. Leonis Gate, the exit leading out from the lower Armory Gate, and the only major exit available to the Chaos Forces, the Great Gate, led down a narrow, winding path filled with the wreckages of previous Imperial attempts. It was not suitable as an escape route. And while certainly, even if the chaotic defenders managed to break out and through all of the Deathcore lines, an unlikely prospect in and of itself, their prospects in the wilds were hardly all that much better, but at the very least then they would escape death for at least a little while longer. Perhaps they would even be able to get picked up by infiltrating transport launched by the Aron's Bane, which was still suspected to be sharking around in the void beyond Vraks. The Lord Inquisitor would have to call another conclave, with what remained of the Grey Knights the Red Scorpions and the Death Corps commanders, to figure out precisely what was next. The logical step would be to move into the citadel and clear it piece by piece. The enemy's great gambit expanding so much at what remained of their heretical and chaos manpower in one last mass charge, little more than a huge sacrificial ritual, had failed. And the enemy, seemingly unwilling to break out either, seemed to be out of options. But the Lord Inquisitor was coming to truly appreciate the lesson that Vraks had taught him, that the enemy always seemed to have something up their sleeves. The campaign had shown that the Lord Inquisitor was, at the very best, an adequate but unimaginative field commander, who had advanced up to the precipice of final victory over the bodies of countless Death Corps guardsmen, and even the Lord Inquisitor would probably be willing to admit that he had only been able to do so through the crushingly superior weight of the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army. But we should not sell the Lord Inquisitor short. He may have been a less than sterling field commander, certainly, and most would agree that the man he had come to replace, Marshal Arnim Kagori, had, in that respect at least, been his superior. But for all that, Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex had been a man of action. He had personally led the assault upon the southern laser defense battery, taking it from within and clearing it out, an action that contributed quite considerably to the taking of the lower gate spur. And, of course, the Lord Inquisitor had led the assault upon the Cardinal Gate personally, exposing himself to considerable danger, and it had been his hand that had slain the greater demon Angergrath, and by doing so, he single-handedly saved the entire campaign from almost certain doom. And so, despite his many failings, none should ever question that the Lord Inquisitor played a vital role in finally bringing the war to a successful conclusion. But that conclusion was still a bit in the future, and the Lord Inquisitor right now was more preoccupied by ordering someone to retrieve his suit of power armor, and of course the sword, as the mighty weapon was far too heavy for him to carry. After all, the Lord Inquisitor was not exactly a young man anymore, and, of course, to order that the attack upon the Cardinal Gate continue, that it be fortified and prepared to receive any potential enemy counterattack. But upon reaching the nearest friendly force and requisitioning that Voxcaster, all of the Lord Inquisitor's worries were suddenly blown out of the water and replaced with an entirely new set of concerns. It turned out that other commanders had been desperately trying to get in contact with the Lord Inquisitor, but due to the proximity to the demon and the atmospheric upheavals that its arrival had caused, no one had been able to reach him. And so it was no doubt an exceptionally frantic voice over the Voxcaster that informed the Lord Inquisitor that an unknown fleet had entered the Vraxian system, sending the Lord Inquisitor, and presumably most of the army and navy, into a bit of a panic. Could this be the reason why the traitors had not attempted to break out reinforcements? But Segmentum Command had not informed them of any such possibility. The observation stations had not detected any trace of incoming Chaos Fleet formations, and yet here it was, an unidentified force bearing down on Vraks with disturbing speed. The Imperial Navy immediately broke low anchor and began moving up to meet it. Even more frantically, the Red Scorpion's battle barge, hanging extraordinarily low in orbital barrage range, was exceptionally vulnerable. Any enemy force launching a long-range attack upon it now would almost certainly blast it into the upper envelope of Vrax's atmosphere and send the mighty vessel spiraling down onto the planet below. Desperately straining its engines to the absolute limits of their capabilities, they flared up into the solar void void and tried to push the massive vessel clear of the gravity well. And down on Vraks itself, the 88th was scurrying around like mad, trying to establish a system of command. The Grey Knights had been slaughtered. Were the Red Hunters still intact? Where was the Lord Inquisitor? Nobody had contact with him. Who was in command if the Lord Inquisitor was dead? The last time anyone had seen him, he had been heading towards the Cardinal Gate, and that was the direction in which the demon had been headed. What about the Red Scorpions? Could they extract themselves? Would they have to abandon the St. Leonis Gate? What forces were still available to deal with the demon? And what if this was a replay of the last time the Chaos Forces had invaded the planet? Preparations would have to be made, the Imperial Navy wings would have to be scrambled and reorganized, defenses would have to be turned around in case of a drop pod assault. The logistical network would have to be defended, storage bunkers emptied and centralized. They had to be protected at all costs. The 88th was entirely focused on defending one small piece of real estate. If a mass drop pod assault struck them now, it could shatter the entire army. And what about the Chaos Forces already on the planet? Legio Volcanum, the Nurgle followers, the Skulltakers warband. Could this be the beginning of the massed counterattack that everyone had feared? The entire 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army was in a state of complete upheaval and panic, along with the Imperial Navy elements, the Legio Astorum forces, and the Space Marines too. The Grey Knights as well were beginning to wonder if they would have to exterminatus the whole planet. They were hovering dangerously over the button that would send their ship's cyclonic torpedoes spiraling down through the atmosphere and into the planet's core. The planet could not be allowed to fall to chaos, and if the 88th looked on the verge of defeat, exterminatus was the only option. And this state would continue for another few hours until finally communication was established with the incoming fleet. It identified itself as the battle barge Liberatori Delictum, accompanied by the strike cruiser Repentant and its escort vessels. They were from the Adeptus Astartes, the Angels of Absolution, dispatched to Vraks on the request of Supreme Grandmaster Azrael of the Dark Angels, and commanded by Interrogator Chaplain Belphegor. And then, almost with complete synchronicity, I imagine that every single commander, whether it be Death Corps, Grey Knight, Red Hunter, Scorpion, or Imperial Navy, whispered silently to themselves, "Cunts." But hey, aside from a handful of heart attacks, it could have been worse. And at least this could, potentially, be good news. Lord Hector Rex was a bit too far up the Inquisitorial hierarchy to immediately assume that the Dark Angels had come to help. But maybe, just maybe, whatever they were after, he could benefit from it as well. However, Interrogator Chaplain Belphegor was quick to disillusion the Lord Inquisitor of any such silly notions of cooperation. The strike force had come specifically on the behest of Supreme Grandmaster Azrael to carry out a very specific objective, namely the capture of the arch-traitor Lord Arcos. The Dark Angels had business with the Lord of the Alpha Legion, both of a personal and private chapter matter. Originally, the Dark Angels were supposed to come themselves, but they were fully engaged in other business, and so the Supreme Grandmaster had requested the Angels of Absolution, a successor chapter of the Dark Angels, to carry out this vital business on their behalf. This did not sit well with the Lord Inquisitor. Lord Arcos, if captured, would be an invaluable treasure trove of information, presuming his tongue could be loosened, but the Ordo had many specialists in that particular field. And whilst normally Lord Hector would be more than happy to cooperate with the Adeptus Astartes, the Dark Angels were a somewhat unique bunch, and their reputation most certainly preceded them. Hector was utterly convinced that if he allowed Lord Arcos to fall into their clutches, nobody would ever hear from him or any intelligence extracted from him ever again. And it's important to stress just the kind of treasure trove we're talking about. If captured alive, a Lord of the Alpha Legion could give all kinds of information. The location of cults, spy rings, infiltrators, sabotage groups, double agents. The sky really was the limit. But if he fell in Dark Angel's custody, the odds of any of that information piquing their interest, considering their somewhat particular goals, were limited. And the Lord Inquisitor tried to make the argument that surely such a wealth of information would be best in the hands of the Ordo Malus, since they could act upon it immediately, regardless of where in the subsector the information may be of use. Because once again, we're not talking about a couple of spies here, or the odd cult here and there. We're talking potentially about an infiltration network spanning the entire sector. But the interrogated chaplain remained unmoved. He had his orders. Unknowns to the Lord Inquisitor, the Dark Angels had been waiting for this moment for quite a while now. Supreme Commander Azrael had kept a close eye on the progress of the siege, and he intended to sweep in at the very end of it, secure Lord Arcos for himself, and then simply just leave. And there would be precious little that the headquarters of the 88th Imperial Guard siege army could possibly do to stop him. The 88th Inquisitorial Guard siege army, however, that complicated the matter. Technically speaking, Lord Hector Rex had a certain degree of authority over the Dark Angels and their successor chapters. But Lord Hector Rex was also an old Inquisitor, with access to forbidden knowledge about the Dark Angels, and he was painfully aware that any attempt to deny them their prize might not be taken in an overly sportsmanlike fashion. Overly curious Inquisitors that had gotten a bit close to that particular chapter had disappeared before, and Lord Hector had no intentions of joining them. And if the interrogated chaplain really felt so strongly about it, then there was nothing to be done. Lord Arcos would almost certainly have to be surrendered to them, unless some trickery could possibly be pulled off at the 11th hour. But there was still an opportunity to utilize the Dark Angel's agenda for his own benefit. Hector Rex informed the interrogated chaplain that the siege was entering into the very last stages right as they spoke. The enemy was at the very brink of defeat, and he was planning an all-out attack upon the citadel to be conducted shortly, and he could not guarantee that Lord Arcos would not become an unfortunate fatality in the final battle. And whilst, of course, he would love to aid the Dark Angels and their successor chapter in their noble pursuit of the Lord, well, he couldn't very well control artillery rounds now, could he? Should the Angels of Absolution, however, choose to share with him their plans for seizing Lord Arcos, then maybe, just maybe, he could assist in some way, shape or form. Finally, we were back to something that the Lord Inquisitor knew how to do well: manipulate others and utilizing his power to ensure their cooperation. After a short period of counseling with one another, interrogator chaplain Belphegor and the leader of the Angels of Absolution strike force, Master Yafrir, agreed to share with the Inquisitor their own plans. They would launch a deep strike assault directly into the citadels itself. A bold move, but one reminiscent of the original plans for seizing the citadel. And with most of its anti-air defenses and virtually all of its orbital defense silos destroyed, well, it was a good plan back then, hindered only by the presence of those very same now destroyed defenses, and so there was no reason why it wouldn't work now. This was good news for the Lord Inquisitor. He could now time his own offensive into the citadel to coincide with the arrival of the Angels of Absolution and the Interrogator Chaplain. But, of course, there was a catch. The Angels of Absolution would only deploy to the surface of Vraks if they were promised custody of any and all Alpha Legion captives, and especially Lord Arcos, and there was to be absolutely no inquisitorial interference either with the prisoners or the Dark Angels returning them to the Rock. This put Rex in a bit more of a difficult situation. He was hoping that maybe he could somehow finesse his way around the capture of Lord Arcos, or secret him away perhaps, or maybe rely upon some nicety to secure at least some Alpha Legion captives. But clearly, the Dark Angels were not in a negotiating mood. And at the end of the day, the Angels of Absolution Strike Force would greatly aid in ending the war quickly, without any further excess of bloodshed. And the Lord Inquisitor was still painfully aware of the agency of his political opposition, and the ability of the heretics to dig in like crazy. They might still have an ace up their sleeve, and if the offensive was delayed yet further, there was every potential that the Ordo Hereticus could yet sweep in on some sort of pretext and dispose Lord Inquisitor Hector, taking all of the glory without doing any of the work. And so, the Lord Inquisitor agreed. The Dark Angels and their successor chapter would be allowed to take into custody any and all Alpha Legion captives, and the Lord Inquisitor would also aid in the capture of Lord Arcos if it became practical. In return, the Angels of Absolution would deploy both ground forces and a deep strike assault upon the citadel, whilst also dispatching the Liberatori Delictum and the Repentant to hunt down the Anarchy's heart. This last part was offered almost like an olive branch to the Inquisitor, as if the Interrogator Chaplain was saying, Now, Inquisitor, look, we will do this kindness for you." I doubt, however, that Lord Hector was overly fooled by this apparent altruism. The Dark Angels wanted to hunt down the Anarchy's heart because it could contain yet another treasure trove of data, in the more literal sense of the word this time. Not to mention the possibility of Alpha Legion personnel still aboard the ship, or possibly Alpha Legion personnel escaping from Vraks. It seemed unlikely that they would be able to escape from the Citadel, but one should never underestimate the sneaky nature of the Alpha Legion. And so, the stage was set for the final act of the war on Vraks. But for that, you're gonna have to wait until the next episode. I figured we'd do a bit of a special at the end here, where we release all of the last episodes in one single week. Won't that be fun? Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching once again, and until next time, have a good day.